Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perticchese, and thank you for joining me as always. Jeff Abercrombie across the way. Jeff, college football championship in the books, NFL regular season in the books. The NFL draft process is really set to kick off. Happy New Year, happy holidays. Glad to be back with you here this evening, Jeff.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a little rusty. It's been a little while, but I'm coming back recharged. I'm ready to, close the books on the fantasy season. Close the books on the NFL season. But obviously with some 49ers rooting interest for the playoffs. But really, when it comes down to football and what's really going to drive my passion, now it's that off season stuff, right? It's the I'm coming in fresh and ready to actually go down in depth to, all of the prospects that we've been talking all season about and really go through it with a fine tooth comb.
Yeah, it's absolutely a fun time of the year. If people were looking for us over the last couple of weeks, we had decided to take off a week there between Christmas and New Year's. We were planning on coming back last week. Obviously, we were watching Monday Night Football, and that just the magnitude of that. We didn't think it was right to record a show with all that going on. Obviously, our thoughts and prayers still with Damar Hamlin and his family. The news has been very encouraging over the last couple of days, and just thinking of him and hoping for a full recovery. So we didn't end up recording last week. So we figured, you know what, let's let the college football season play itself out. We'll figure out what the top of the draft order is going to look like, who the national champion is, and kind of just recap it all. And that's kind of what we're going to do today. So Jeff, why don't we jump right into it? We haven't really talked much about performances from bowl season. I know there was a couple performances. The Alabama game really stood out, a couple performances. Then obviously the national championship didn't really live up to expectations in terms of a competitive game. Obviously the semifinals games were absolutely riveting stuff. So why don't we start there? I'll bring up the name because I think the guy whose performance will resonate the most in the pre-draft process and potentially have impacted his outlook more than anybody was CJ Stroud. And it might sound crazy to say because CJ Stroud has been a guy that we've been talking about for 2 years. He's been a guy that's been thought of and highly regarded. I did think prior to that performance against Georgia that the NFL was going to have legitimate questions about him. I had some legitimate questions, and I still do. One performance is not going to make all those questions, dissipate and go away. But I think there was a scenario where CJ Stroud could have had a little bit of a fall out of the top 5, maybe even the top 10. Maybe Will Levis could have been taken ahead of him, even though it's not something I personally agree with. And then that performance by CJ Stroud against Georgia, he showed so many things that I believe there were legitimate questions about. And now it's on tape. Some of the things that I was really concerned about, why I was thinking, is he somewhere in the Mac Jones, kind of, Dwayne Haskins when Dwayne Haskins was coming out, Josh Rosen, is he in that world? I know a couple of weeks ago, I thought you brought up a really apt comparison of like, he might have to be like Tua at the next level, that point guard, that distributor, because there were legitimate questions about his ability to throw on the move, playoff structure, utilize his athleticism that he has, that he wasn't really ever asked to use, and his ability to handle pressure. I thought those were all very concerns about CJ Stroud. I thought he was great when he was, playing in structure and in a rhythm and clean pockets, but we know that that's not realistic at the NFL level. And that game against Georgia, he answered so many questions that I feel like I've been waiting 2 years to see him in those situations handle pressure better, throw on the move, and utilize his athleticism more than he ever wanted to. And then that game, I feel like really changed the dynamic with him. And now I kind of feel like, I could see some teams even putting him ahead of Bryce Young on their board. I think they both go in the first handful of picks. I mean, Will Anderson, Jalen Carter are 2 special defensive prospects. So maybe you're talking about in some order, those are the 4 guys that go off the board. But I do think CJ Stroud's performance really potentially changed the narrative and maybe started his pre-draft process now out, with a big conclusion to his season in terms of answering those legitimate questions that I think people had about him. Now he goes out with that performance in that game, I think changes the narrative a little bit heading into the pre-draft circuit.
Yeah, I don't even think we have to guess, right? I mean, if you follow the plugged in NFL draft mix, those ones, disseminating what they're hearing from NFL teams, like they've said as just as much, that performance, on that stage was enough to change NFL executives' minds on him. Like it was point blank, straight from the sources. I'm with you. I don't think everybody, bowl season was, was a very entertaining bowl season, but I don't think it really shook the landscape up very significantly, except for CJ Stroud. I think that's, the one that, really comes to mind, because we're not talking about, a third round, a second round. I mean, we're talking about, a mid round one to a probably top 5 pick. And I do think that's well deserved. Just because a player isn't going to be, Patrick Mahomes. And first of all, Patrick Mahomes wasn't, thought of Patrick Mahomes. He didn't go in the top 5 picks, right? You still, if you took a pick and, knowing what we know about Tua, like, I don't think the Dolphins regret that still, right? Like, you have to have competent quarterback play, and it's really hard to find. And if we find somebody who's showing us signs that, to me, what this showed is this wasn't, I still think of CJ Stroud the same way I saw him from previous games, where, he is going to be best with good structure around him. I think that comparison really, I'm maybe a little bit anchored on now, but what it really showed me was he can translate that to an NFL difficulty, right? And he can make the most of good structure around him, maybe when the entire recipe isn't perfect for him. And I think that, that's exactly what you want to see to kind of eliminate some of the risk of spending a top 10 pick.
Yeah, and I think the question that I had most on him was Bryce Young. While he has his concerns, mostly his arm talent and obviously the size and frame, he's such an elite level problem solver, right? Like that if he's going to be a great quarterback at the next level, he's going to do it in a Drew Brees like way, right? In terms of, how he plays in the pocket and solves problems and, and I think he's got more athleticism than Drew Brees. I think his pocket movement inside the pocket is a little Russ Wilson-esque. So I've been saying I think he's a little part Russ Wilson, but not nearly the arm talent, but throwing from different arm platforms and moving around inside the pocket. And then like that Drew Brees type, problem solving is how he's going to win at the next level. And I felt like CJ Stroud wasn't really much of a problem solver. And part of it was great scheme at Ohio State. First read, great wide receivers, his 2 years where he was really the guy. So most of his reads were there, and then once in a while we would see a moment where he seemed to struggle against pressure or that. But this game against Georgia and that team, and we saw what they just did to TCU last night, Ohio State, you can make the case that if I kind of believe if Marvin Harrison, and I didn't think it was going to be close, but I think if Marvin Harrison doesn't get hurt, Ohio State wins that game. Like, I honestly don't believe Georgia finds a way to win that game if Marvin Harrison doesn't get hurt, because he was uncoverable. And I think Ohio State would have made enough plays. I mean, it went down to the wire, and he missed most of the game early in the game and had to leave. So he just showed more problem-solving capabilities. And for NFL people, they see it once, they think it's in there, and then they can get it out of him. And I think that's what you were kind of saying, right? This game sold people in the NFL, and I think that's going to be the case. Because they're going to say, listen, we saw it. We saw it in that national championship game. We saw it on the biggest, the semifinal game. We saw it on the biggest stage. We saw him do it against Georgia, who's got loaded talent in terms of NFL caliber talent. We think that if he gets put in a situation here where he's got to handle pressure, play a little bit more of structure, it's in his arsenal, even though we didn't see much of it at Ohio State. Maybe it was more of a product he just didn't need to. until that moment where, against Georgia, it was called for. So I think it was a really remarkable performance. I watched Bryce Young. I was stunned that Bryce Young even played. I give a lot of credit to the Alabama guys for all playing in that game. All the top guys, Will Anderson, Bryce Young, Jahmyr Gibbs, all of them. They all played, and Bryce Young put on a show and showing why, he's at the top or second in most quarterback ranks, why he's going to be one of the first handful of picks in the NFL draft. And, listen, he's not for everybody. People who want to check off boxes, he's not checking off the arm talent box. He's not checking off, major, athleticism. It's okay. It's average to above average, but he's not checking off like top level athleticism. He's not checking off size. He's not checking off frame. None of that stuff. But problem solver, ball placement, accuracy, reading coverages, reading defenses, finding ways to make things happen. I think that's what's going to get him pushed towards the top of the draft for sure. So I thought that was a really impressive performance. I know we're mostly talking draft guys, but it was nice to see Jermaine Burton really played well in that game. Hopefully that kind of springboards him to next year, and we get back to the guy that we thought could have been a first round pick this year. So I thought that stood out about that game as well. Do you have any thoughts on either Bryce Young or Burton or anything else from any of the games last weekend?
Well, it was really good to see. I think Jalen Hyatt had a pretty good game too. It was really good to see Burton, maybe just feel a little bit more comfortable there. There's going to have to be some new rapport with a new quarterback as Bryce Young leaves. But again, I'm not going to just forget about Burton after a down year, right? So that was really good to see. Some other really names popped up. I think Jalen Hyatt comes to mind. I do really think he's going to be a big riser. It's really hard to take a look at the season he put together as a whole and look back on a historical track record of receivers who've been picked, round 1, round 2 of the NFL draft. I don't think it's out of, especially if he has a blazing fast combine, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that we see his name in round 1.
Yeah, I actually think there's a good chance that we do, to be honest with you. I think I was unfamiliar until recently talking to my good friend Brandon Jones, who used to help out here at Saturday Sunday as well. Right now, the two of the top free agent wide receivers in the NFL are Juju Smith and Darius Slayton. And that's no knock on Darius Slayton. He's actually had a pretty solid year for the Giants and really helped them a lot. Juju Smith's had some, ups and downs, but he's been better this year than he was. But that tells me, yeah, we know there's going to be trades, right? We've already heard whispers about DeAndre Hopkins. Who knows if Devontae Adams is on the move again? Maybe T. Higgins. I've heard, I don't know if you have anything, but there's Brandon Ayuk's name has been thrown around. Would the 49ers contemplate moving him for, because they don't see themselves, maybe investing big money in another offensive skill player, but whatever. But the point is, it's not a very upgrading wide receiver with NFL talent right now there's not a lot of avenues in this offseason. So even though we don't love this wide receiver draft class, even though it's not nearly as talented as the last couple classes, I think we're still going to end up seeing 4 go in the first round or so, maybe even 5. I don't think it'll be as early as they were last year. I think it more might be like 17 to 32, and you see a late run on those guys. And if any fall, they go early on day 2. And Quentin Johnston's performance against Michigan really stood out as well. He had that one play, kind of took it to the house, but just showing his speed, his explosion, his burst for a man his size. Obviously, we know he can win at the catch point as well. He seems to be gaining momentum as the consensus wide receiver 1 from what's out there. So, that was an impressive performance. Obviously, we were hoping we were going to see a little bit more of a game from TCU last night against Georgia to see him, but, that didn't really get a chance to happen. But the performance against Michigan obviously was impressive. Yeah, so I thought those are the things that kind of stood out the most about, the bowl games. I thought there was a couple of moments here or there, but I didn't think a lot of it, too altered. A lot of guys sit these games out now, start to turn their attention, to the pre-draft circuit and stuff like that. But those are kind of things that, I thought it resonated a little bit. I think it was the quarterbacks, and a couple you mentioned Jalen Hyatt. We talked about Quentin Johnston. I think those are the things that kind of stood out the most in terms of that. So why don't we kind of transition this over to, some of the other draft news, since we've been on a couple weeks ago. Let's start with the transfer portal. The two names that, well, technically three. I don't even have one on my list. I'll start with that one. Sam Hartman going from Wake Forest to Notre Dame. And this is a guy who I think in Notre Dame, he could really potentially garner some momentum at Notre Dame if he has a really strong year. I always thought he was a guy that was probably on that day 3, round 4, round 6 range, but he could be a guy that if he really performs well at Notre Dame, I could see him moving up the ranks a little bit. DJ Uiagalelei decided to take his game to Oregon State, fresh start. It'd be interesting to see him there out of Clemson. Can he get the momentum back? Listen, we saw Bo Nix leave Auburn and go to Oregon and perform really well. I think that's the path DJ Uiagalelei is going to try to take. Maybe we see him put up a performance like we saw Michael Penix Jr. this year. I think those are in the cards. And if we see that by Uiagalelei, I think he has a chance to kind of catapult his draft stock maybe back into the day 2 mix. Jaheim Bell, like the tight end / offensive weapon that I definitely thought was going to come out with the success we saw this year of Chigakonkwo. I thought Jaheim Bell maybe was going to be the next guy like that. But he's going to Florida State. And as someone who follows Florida State closely as his college football team, I'm kind of excited about Florida State next year. I think, ESPN came out with some early 2023 ranks today. Florida State was number 4. It might be finally Florida State returning to maybe top of the heap type prominence and be in the mix. And Jaheim Bell is a really nice player to kind of add there as a diverse, versatile offensive weapon. So, Jeff, any thoughts on a couple of those guys in the transfer portal? Is there somebody that sticks out you're kind of excited to maybe see wear them in their new spot?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jaheim Bell would be a really good one just because I am interested in Florida State. Jordan Travis, I think, we've mentioned his name. We've seen some flashes there, like that could coalesce, and adding an interesting weapon, really could be the spice on top, the right last little ingredient to really make that cook. I do think it's an interesting one because it's not like we've seen, the program. I think of the program more as a defensive, draft feeder to the NFL. And at least lately, I know we have a couple great players that came, that are on the NFL field that came there, but it's been a while. And so it's going to be really interesting to see if all those pieces gel. So that one's pretty fascinating to me. I mean, I do think, I liked seeing that how Bo Nix, has, really found a place that he can play well and put good football on tape on Saturdays and, and excel, right? Like that Oregon program, really took off with him. Could we see the same type of thing with DJ? I think we could. It's possible. It's one of those things where it doesn't get me too excited because I think we're at a point where we know a bit of what his flaws are and what's going to hold him back. And I don't think we're going to get to the level of excitement that we once had for DJ, right? Like we had thought that DJ Uiagalelei would be a top 5 pick when he stepped in and played in the college football playoffs lights out. And it's just once we got those reps, once we got a chance to see him more, I think we finally got a chance to really ground ourselves into who he's been as a player. Now there's always players that come out and make leaps, right? We've always said development isn't linear. And so it really could be as something where just everything triggers and he's got the tools to do it. So, but it's just one of those ones where, I think I'm probably going to have to see that on the NFL side before I get really excited again.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And these Guys who, we see, once upon a time thought of very highly and then they kind of have a fall. I feel like we do wait a little bit and are a little bit more reserved to kind of start to bring them back up again, right? And I think Uiagalelei falls in that. Another guy who I'll talk about right now in terms of returning, just before we came on air, Spencer Rattler decided to go back to school, right? He's another guy who, not this year, but last year, we thought he was going to be in the mix. Him and Sam Howell would be the first and second quarterbacks off the board in the top 10, right? Obviously, we all know how that went, but he really came on strong at the end of this year. So I'm kind of excited that he's going back to school. Like, if he can put together a whole year similar to how he kind of concluded down the stretch, I think he's a guy, though, that, like, once upon a time we thought he had the traits to go top 5 in the NFL draft, and it just didn't work out last year. And I mean, it's nothing to be, losing your job to Caleb Williams isn't something that, anybody should have held against them too much. Obviously, I understand he was struggling and inconsistent, which is why, but Caleb Williams would almost send anybody to the bench, right? So it is interesting to kind of see if he can kind of get that back. We already know that, the top of next year theoretically looks really intriguing. And if guys like Rattler, Uiagalelei, or Bo Nix is returning to school and Michael Penix's return to school, like, it's becoming even more of an interesting quarterback class next year, because some of these guys really took major steps this year. And if they continue to show growth and they continue to show consistency, it's just going to make that quarterback class, even after the top names like the Caleb Williams, and the Drake May, it's going to make it even maybe a deeper and potentially better overall quarterback class with a couple of these guys that are looking for some fresh starts. And if they find it, we could be talking about them a lot next year as well. The other big returning was Blake Corum. It sounded like his injury was a lot more serious than let on. I saw something today that said it might be 6 months before he could even do anything. So he'd pretty much missed the whole pre-draft process. I do think it is a risky proposition to go back to school. We've seen teams be willing to still invest day 2 picks in a guy who might not play most of the year. I think Corum would eventually have been able to play next year in the NFL. But he goes back to school. He's coming off a great year, a monster year. I thought he was kind of locked in as RB4 in this class. And now, we hope he gets back, stays healthy, and still goes as high as what we thought he could have went. I know you were a big fan. I think we both thought there was a real chance he could have been gone in the top 10, 15 picks of round 2. What's your thoughts, Jeff, on Corum? Do you think it's the right decision? Were you surprised by it? Any thoughts?
What surprised me was hearing how, maybe potentially serious the knee was, because it just, he had come in the next week, I think, too, and only lasted a couple snaps before he had to leave. But I think he played on it after he suffered the injury. So hearing just how severe it is, and maybe that's just they needed surgery to clean it up, and surgery takes a while sometimes, and maybe it was something like that. But it seems to me with this decision that there were going to be enough questions when it came through medical's time, that even with the resume he put down, he wouldn't have been able to back it up with any testing. So you couldn't really tell, you couldn't confirm what you were seeing. And this isn't Blake Corum, 3-year stud like Bijan. This is Blake Corum, superstar standout, this year, who's really catapulted his stock. And so there's probably enough uncertainty, coupled with the fact that we've talked about it, a ton of day 2 potential players, that I don't know if a team really would want to take on the risk when there's a viable alternative option without the risk. And so it's a very complicated situation. I don't know what the right answer was for him or wasn't for him, but I trust that he's making it for himself. It is incredibly intriguing because bowl season we had Donovan Edwards really get a bunch of the hype now, and we talked about it on the lead in to this, to the 22 season, what that backfield potentially could be. How was it going to shape out with them sharing? Donovan Edwards has a very interesting skill set, especially as a receiver, and Corum really took and ran with it. But Edwards has shown that, he still is quite capable behind him. And does he also take a step forward? Do we see a bigger split? Do we see a dip in stats with Corum? How much do we hold against him with that? Or is it, are we over our skis a little bit putting Donovan Edwards back up there? I think that's the really fascinating conversation to me that I haven't fully sorted out. And it really will be this kind of off season of rookie Devi that we get to, to debate, especially as we get maybe some of our more Devi focused contributors on, as guests.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun to kind of pick their brain a little bit in terms of how to make sense of this injury, how to make sense of his value, and where we go, because the odds of him replicating this year again are probably pretty low, right? Just how great of a year he had there. So it'll be interesting. And then a couple other guys who declared, who we didn't talk about last time, Jarren Hall out of BYU. I really like his game. I think he could be a guy in that round 3, round 4 border. I think he's got some dual versatility. He can make plays with his legs. He can buy time in the pocket, out of the pocket, throw on the run. So I'm really interested by Hall there out of BYU. And then Sean Tucker out of Syracuse. Obviously, didn't have the year that I think maybe people were expected, in terms of not kind of catapulting himself into that top mix. I still think he's in like the next tier though, after the top 3 or so. So I still think there's a legit chance he goes somewhere on day 2, maybe more of a round 3 guy than a round 2 guy. And then obviously Kayshon Boutee changing his mind, declaring. I think he still is on the border of round 1. I still think he's a top 50 pick. We'll talk a little bit about some top 5s in a few minutes, but I think Boutee's right there in the mix in this wide receiver group, because as we've been talking about a lot, I think it's going to be to each their own, kind of depending on what you want. Do you want the legit 4.2 speed of Jalen Hyatt? Do you want the vertical playmaking out of the slot, of Jordan Addison? Do you want the precise route runner and Jackson Smith and the Jigba? Do you want Boutee, who has probably the highest ceiling and most upside, but we still haven't seen him put together a dominant stretch? And then obviously before we talked about Quentin Johnston, right? And he probably is the most complete guy right now in terms of, at the catch point, athleticism, what people are looking for maybe as that true outside type guy. But interesting for Boutee to change his mind. I think it's the right decision. We talked about it. Like, I don't think, I'm not sure LSU and that offensive scheme is conducive to him putting up these really gaudy collegiate stats. And if he's still going to be a potential first round pick or early second round pick, I think him going back to school and not being really, really good would hurt his stock more than him coming out right now would hurt it. So I think coming out now, still going round 1 or early round 2 is, yeah. If everything broke right, could he have pushed his way back into the top 15, top 20 mix next year? Maybe. But if he had a bad year, if he got hurt, if there was any issues that arise, I think you're talking about him falling, out of the top 2 rounds. And I think that would have hurt. So I kind of get the move. We thought since the first week of the season, he was on his way out, and we were stunned, at how the rest of the year kind of played itself out there. So Jeff, any thoughts on the guys, who made their declaration since we last been on air in terms of the major skill players?
Yeah, I didn't have a big opinion on whether Blake Corum's decision was smart or not, because I just didn't have enough of a read on the inputs into it. But I can tell from the West Coast here that Kayshon Boutee was not going to fit into that LSU program, right? And he was going back. He wasn't transferring. He was going back to that LSU program, and it just wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to be a fit. And it doesn't mean it was something that he is a cancer to the locker room or he's a unmanageable player or anything. I mean, we see players with emotion like George Pickens, doing amazing things on an NFL field. So I think getting to the NFL is really where Boutee's going to shine. And, I do think, I don't know if I see round 1. I do think he's right in that range of that George Pickens, right? That, 40 to 60 as far as picks go. And I think it's pretty safe. I just don't think there's enough questions on his profile to keep him out of round 1. There's enough talent on his film to just have, round 2 be his absolute floor.
Yeah, I think I'm right there with you. And, I think if he tests out really well, listen, I think the wide receivers is kind of up for grabs a little bit. And we kind of mentioned the 5 guys, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. But with the NFL season concluded, I thought maybe it would be a fun time to kind of just run through what the current top of the draft order looks like, and just some things that maybe stood out in terms of, how many teams could be in the quarterback mix, how high do we think a wide receiver can go, would any of these teams in the top whatever be thinking Bijan? So amazingly, Houston loses out on the number 1 pick by scoring a touchdown late in the game and then going for 2 and getting it. So Chicago is now picking at number 1, which opens up a whole can of worms about potentially trading it, because if they're all in on Justin Fields. Houston picking at number 2, Arizona, just cleaning house yesterday, firing their GM and their coach. So they're picking at number 3. Kyler Murray probably missing a big chunk of next year. The Colts are going to be picking number 4, dire need of a quarterback. At number 5 is going to be Seattle from Denver due to the Russell Wilson trade. Number 6 is going to be Detroit from the Rams due to the Matthew Stafford trade. I mean, I don't think Seattle or Detroit ever thought that when they made that trade, they would be getting these picks from Denver and the Rams. It's just, remarkable that, they lose their franchise quarterbacks, both of those teams. And then both of those teams within 2 years are bottom feeders, and Seattle and Detroit are getting a pick at number 5 and number 6. Vegas is picking number 7. They obviously a lot of question marks now with, what they did with Carr at the end of the year. He'll be going somewhere. I know in New York, it seems like everyone seems to think it's a foregone conclusion that either Jimmy Garoppolo or Carr will be the quarterback of the Jets. We'll see. At number 8, the Atlanta Falcons. Do they believe in Desmond Ridder? I think that's a legit question, or do they go to quarterback market or kind of build up the team around it? Probably defense. Carolina picking at number 9. Philadelphia from New Orleans picking at 10. That's the Chris Olave trade. Well, not the Chris. Yeah, well, there's a lot of wheels in motion. They eventually got the Chris Olave, but it took a bunch of trades between New Orleans to get there. And then that last one, to get that extra first-round pick that they then had to use to eventually get up to Olave. They gave Philadelphia their first-round pick to get a second first-round pick last year. And then, so Philly's picking at number 10, Tennessee 11, Houston picking 12 from Cleveland due to the Deshaun Watson trade. And then Jets 13, New England 14, Packers 15, Washington 16, Pittsburgh 17, and 18 Detroit before the playoff teams. Jeff, a few quick hitters. What stands out about what you hear and see in terms of that draft order? Things that you're like, wow, I can't wait till late April gets around here, because I think it's going to be fascinating in terms of how they approach it, what they do. Anything stand out? Early thoughts on just seeing the draft order now complete and finalize, in terms of what we also know about this draft class also.
Yeah, everybody's talking about Chicago. I think mostly because we're shocked that somehow, some way, they were able to leapfrog Houston for that top pick. I don't see any logical reason they'll move away from Justin Fields. So I do think they can just sit there and pick, Will Anderson, Jalen Carter. Like, they'll really need a centerpiece on that defense. That defense was the defense. Justin Fields played great. The defense is what was holding them back. But do they try to trade down? Maybe into the 7 to 14 range, pick up a couple day 2 picks, maybe, I don't know if there's, I have to look at kind of the bottom of the draft order too, see if anybody's giving up 2 first-round picks, but do they reload around Justin Fields? Do they build, a centerpiece around the defense? I think that's going to be a fascinating path, but it's kind of nothing stunning about that, right? I think Houston, well, they lost the number 1 pick. Their big winners was for CJ Stroud looking good, right? If they have 2 top quarterbacks on the board with Young and Stroud, then they'll be fine, right? Regardless if anybody jumps them. Biggest one for me is Las Vegas, Carolina, Atlanta. I mean, I think we could say all of those teams need a quarterback. I think with Atlanta and Desmond Ridder, I think it has less to do with Ridder and more to do with the type of offense they run. They run that very Tennessee style offense, with Arthur Smith coming over. And they might not want to invest big resources in a quarterback if they don't have the belief that that quarterback's really going to make a difference in that franchise. They kind of want to be a system that succeeds as a system. And it kind of worked. I don't think anybody saw Atlanta winning 7 games this year, right? And the only reason they're at 8 is because of tiebreakers. I mean, the Jets are at 13 with 7 wins. They really could have been picking out of the side of the top 10. I don't think anybody saw it. They called Atlanta one of the worst teams to begin the season with. So that's fascinating. I don't know what they'll do there. I do think Vegas and Carolina are almost locked into having to take somebody. I don't really like. There's going to be interesting veteran options this offseason. I do think we could very legitimately see Aaron Rodgers move at this point. And if not Aaron Rodgers, I'm pretty sure Jordan Love's going to find a home. I don't see how Green Bay goes back with both of those quarterbacks. With the way where Love's contract is at this point, I think 1 or 2 years left. So, there's going to be a few interesting veteran paths this offseason, but let's just say Young and Stroud, you're going to have to get in the top 5, right? Chicago, you got Houston, Indianapolis. If you're not jumping ahead of them, you might not get one of those 2 guys. So is it Anthony Richardson? Is it Will Levis? Does Will Levis go to Indianapolis because they like that profile, and a guy like Bryce Young drop to the 3rd pit, with CJ Stroud's performance, in the playoffs, and Indianapolis maybe being in on a guy like Levis because of the profile that they want for their offense. Does Bryce Young fall into the range of Las Vegas? Does Anthony Richardson fall to Carolina? I think those are going to be really fascinating questions that we'll see on every mock draft from here to April. But that also means that right now we're pushing up quarterbacks, artificially inflating those quarterbacks into draft positions that, we talked about it with when we compared Stroud to Tua. Like, are they, they're being drafted not to be signal callers, but to be saviors of the franchise, right? To be the face. And they're investing that draft capital in them to maybe be players they're not, or potentially one day could be, but aren't right now. And forgoing some really fascinating talent, like other talent across the board with, defensive players with, there's some really good tackles in this class. Like, you could have some blue chip building blocks, along the trenches that you're passing along. And we've seen that be a very fruitful way of building teams, along the trenches. We've seen a lot of teams go ahead and invest that way and find success. So how that all unfolds in the top 10 picks, I think we'll get a lot more clarity come April, but it is going to be fascinating the road that we get there.
Yeah, and I will say this. I think Geno Smith and Jared Goff will be the quarterbacks next year for Seattle and Detroit. But I also don't think it's crazy to think that those 2 teams look at their rosters and say to themselves, listen, we were gifted this pick here at 5 and 6. Both of our teams are on the upswing. We're teams that, Seattle made the playoffs. Detroit was right there. If Seattle would have lost, Detroit would have been in because they beat Green Bay. So I don't think it's crazy to think that they could be looking at their teams and saying, listen, we're going to be hopefully be picking in, the 20s next year because we're playoff caliber teams. And we kind of just, we kind of sped up the rebuild a little bit, especially in Seattle, that if they like these quarterbacks enough, I think they could pull the trigger. And if not, I do think you're going to hear an ungodly amount of connections, though, to those teams, because they're going to want to try to convince Las Vegas, maybe Atlanta, Carolina, that they're going to take a quarterback and try to force them to move up to 5 or 6.
Yeah,
The
other fascinating aspect too is, I mean, Detroit and Seattle have other first-round picks where it is a more reasonable spot in my mind to take a guy like Will Levis, Anthony Richardson. If you're taking them in the teens, right? you've got your blue chip talent at the top of the draft, and now you can really take a swing at one of those players, especially with a good presence like a Jared Goff. I think with Seattle, they're going to have a hard time playing that game, right? Because Geno, I believe, is a free agent, or he's not going to come back to Seattle without a contract extension or something, right? Like they're going to have to make a decision on him before we get to the draft. So I think we'll have, no matter how much they want to hide their intentions or say we'll sign him, but we're also taking a quarterback, however they want to try to, play that game, leverage game, I think their cards are going to be tipped a little bit. I think with Detroit, it's more interesting because I also think the 49ers method, right? They draft Trey Lance, but they're going in with Jimmy Garoppolo. I think that could really be a plan for Detroit. Like they're fine with Jared Goff going in next year. But that doesn't mean that they're not fine also putting somebody like, Bryce Young or Anthony Richardson on that team, to kind of sit there and marinate, get the experience he needs. I think it's a really viable path for NFL teams to do that. And I think these, having stable bridge quarterbacks is a really underrated value for teams like Detroit.
Yeah, and we talked about Chicago having a lot of power, right, to maybe make a trade down. But what if they don't want it? What if they just want to sit there and take Will Anderson? They think he's the best player in the draft, face their defense. Then all of a sudden, Arizona is really in a spot, and they're going to have a new GM. And say Houston takes their quarterback of choice, whether it's Bryce Young or whether it's CJ Stroud. Well, we know Indianapolis is in the quarterback market. We just talked about Seattle, Detroit, and we know all the teams after Vegas, Atlanta, Carolina could be. All of a sudden, you want to make sure you get your guy ahead of Indianapolis. You got to try to jump up to number 3 where Arizona is. So that whoever the Arizona, I think there's a lot of question marks. I don't think it's it's a job that people are going to look at and think they're really set up. I think there's a lot of question marks about Kyler Murray. Next year, he's probably not going to play much. But I do think from the draft perspective, Arizona at number 3 really is going to hold the cards to a lot of things in this draft, especially if Chicago ends up staying put and just taking like Will Anderson or something. And then Houston takes the quarterback, then all of a sudden all eyes shift to Arizona. What will Indianapolis be willing to give them just to move up one pick to make sure nobody else leapfrogs them and they lose out their guy? Or are they okay with 2 guys? Is Indianapolis think it's a 3 quarterback class, right? So it's going to be fascinating at the top there with the quarterbacks. I will say this to kind of conclude talking about this. I do think 11, 12, 14, and 15, Tennessee, Houston, New England, and Green Bay. I think that is where we will see an offensive skill player start to come off the board. I think Tennessee, even though they went Treylon Burks last year, I would not be stunned to see them double dip back-to-back years, wide receiver. I don't think it's out of realm of possibilities based on how poor their offense was. A guy like Quentin Johnston, whoever, their favorite wide receiver. So I do think Tennessee, but they need a lot of offensive line help. So that might be the way they go. It's more of their DNA. But at the same time, they fired their offensive coordinator. They're making changes there. I think they realize they got to modernize and maybe open things up a little bit more. So I could see them going to wide receiver there. I think Houston is in a really interesting situation here because if they go quarterback at 2, there's a couple ways you can play it at 12. If you want an offensive playmaker, you could get him a wide receiver. Michael Mayer, how high does he go? Would you want to get your young quarterback, the best tight end in the class? I think it's a little high for my liking, but I don't think it's out of the possibility. I like Dameon Pierce. I think he's a good player. We've seen 4th round running backs be good players and
Bijan in Texas, yeah.
And that not stop things. You want to change you want to, Bijan, keep him home, him and your quarterback, whether it's him and Bryce Young, him and CJ Stroud, your entire face of your team is totally changed right there with those 2 picks. You're going to sell jerseys, you're going to sell tickets, you're going to sell season tickets. I don't think it's crazy, right? To consider that they could be, could look at Bijan, right? And then you have the Patriots at 14. I think we all know that wide receiver has been an area of struggle for quite some time. they could be in the market for a wide receiver. I know they got Taquan Thornton last year and he showed some things, but he's more of a speed outside guy. I mean, maybe they're looking at a Jordan Addison or a Jackson Smith in the Jigba, or maybe just a pure outside guy like Quentin Johnston. Green Bay, I know they went to the well last year, but if Aaron Rodgers is coming back, I don't think it's crazy that they finally say, okay, I know we got a few guys last year. Christian Watson, showed us something. Romeo Dobbs is okay, but probably more of like a number 3-4 type. Maybe they go back to the well and give Aaron Rodgers one more weapon. So I think 11 through 15 will probably be the sweet spot where we start getting, those guys for fantasy. Obviously, minus the quarterbacks, we're going to go early. I think that's the range where we might start seeing some offensive skill player movement. Washington would surprise me. Pittsburgh would surprise me. Detroit would surprise me. So I think of the non-playoff teams, what we just had there, unless there's obviously trade ups, I think those 4 teams, Tennessee, New England, Green Bay, and Houston, would probably be the teams to really to hone in on if we're trying to say where could some of these offensive skill players go. Do you have any thoughts on that before?
Yeah, Jackson Smith and Jigba being a souped up prime Randall Cobb for Aaron Rodgers would be pretty exciting. I mean, we would see, I think, a Juju Smith-Schuster, rookie, sophomore kind of season there, potentially. You talked about Tennessee being on the skill player, needing offensive lines. I mean, they're a dark horse for a quarterback too, right? I know they just drafted Malik Willis. They're not in love with him. He was inactive. He was the third string. They started Josh Dobbs. They're clearly not in, we've seen, shake up in that organization because they have a differing direction on where the franchise needs to go. Right. And so are they going to do some serious self-scouting this offseason and say, we missed the playoffs. We lost 7 in a row. We're not who we think we are. And do we need to rethink this? Is Ryan Tannehill an option for us, or do we send him somewhere and hit a reset button on this? I mean, I think that's fascinating, and just take it to another level. We talk about these quarterbacks. Who's going to be doing the advanced scouting to the 2024 quarterback class? It's always risky to say we're going to pass on a guy this year because we think next year we'll grab him, and then you end up like Seattle and you're pick 20 and you're not going to get him. But there's always ways to trade up, right? If you really believe somebody's special, you can trade up. So how, just does that play into the equation, right? Does Houston? Well, Houston's probably taking one, right? But does Atlanta, right? We're going to stick it out with Ritter. If it doesn't work this year, we'll be picking early enough, and we'll get a guy next year. So does Atlanta, really just play it patient? Anyway, 2024 class looks really good too, and might be where the actual solutions for some of these franchises come.
Yeah, and teams are looking ahead, right? And maybe a team that we think is definitely going to take a quarterback or wants to take a quarterback might not take a quarterback this year, right? Like maybe they just say, "No, we're gonna, we're gonna take the best player available," and maybe that's Will Anderson or Jalen Carter or somebody like that. I'd be surprised if Houston didn't. I'd be surprised if some other teams, Indianapolis didn't.
Yeah.
But, Indy's the one that really, I think, would surprise me the most because, I mean, how many times could they just go back to the veteran well and it be a colossal dumpster fire,
How about
right?
this? How about does Detroit, trade back and pick up draft capital for 2024, right? Like they're a good team. They might not be picking in the top, but if they have a few first round picks, if they trade out and trade back and pick up somebody else's first round pick, 1, it could be early, or 2, that's enough ammunition to jump up and go early. So that'd be something that'd be fascinating for Detroit.
And Seattle loves to trade, right? That their GM, and they've made more trades, probably them in Baltimore, and New England probably have made more trades in the draft than anybody in my life covering the draft. So, both those teams right there could be saying, oh, like we believe in Goff and we believe in Geno, but let's also get some ammunition. So, if next year, because I think even if Geno's back, I think it's going to be more of one of those like 3-year deals that they can get out of after 2. The first year he's guaranteed to be the starter. The second one, we'll see if they want to move on from him by year 3, they can. That would be my guess at his age. He did have some struggles down the second half of the year. maybe one of those like 3 or 60 million type deals or whatever, and see how it's structured, obviously, is what really matters. But it's going to be fun. I like that we finally have the draft order kind of in place now. I think it's fun to start talking about things. You see there's more teams than maybe we think who needed quarterbacks early on. And I think it's a perfect segue to talk about, some top fives to kind of round out the show tonight, where things currently stand in terms of like just what we hear and what's out there at the quarterback position. We've kind of talked about, the three: Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, and Will Levis. I think from everything we're hearing, it seems like those are the guys who the NFL is highest on right now. And I think they all probably go top 10. And then I think Anthony Richardson is the wild card. I think he seems to be a guy that the NFL is intrigued with. So I would say he's probably the fourth guy that you're seeing in lists. And then I think the fifth one is kind of up for grabs. I think some people, I think the safer choice is Tanner McKee out of Stanford, but I do think Hendon Hooker is interesting, right? If he didn't get injured, would he be definitively that guy in that spot there? So I think the first four guys, I'd be stunned. I don't know the order those guys are going to go off the board, but I'd be stunned if those top four aren't the quarterbacks that come off the board in some order as the first four guys. But I think after that, it kind of opens up, right? I think it could be Tanner McKee somewhere on day 2 or Hendon Hooker somewhere on day 2. And then, a lot of guys chose to go back to school, right? We don't have Michael Penix. We don't have Spencer Rattler. We don't have Bo Nix. Those would have been the guys that maybe would have been in that mix that maybe would have snuck into day 2. So I think Hooker and McKee kind of probably are locked into day 2. And then that would be 6. That's a lot in the top 100. Do we have any more? Does Jake Haener make a name for himself? Max Dugan. Like, I don't think those guys are top 100 guys. I think they're more Dave Berry type guys. But I think McKee and Hooker are going to be interesting. And then, does Jarren Hall kind of work his way into the mix there, with Haener or with Duggan? I think it's that next tier. But that's kind of how I see it. I don't think there's going to be a ton of movement in terms of who's the top 5 guys or maybe top 6 guys. I think there'll be some shuffling the deck, and each person might have ranking slightly different. But Jeff, any thoughts right now if you were gonna take a lean on who that number 5 guy is? Because I think that's the one if we're talking top 5s here. Hooker coming off the injury at the age, or the guy who played behind a really poor team this year in Tanner McKee out of Stanford. Where do you think right now the NFL might be leaning in terms
Honestly,
of who? Oh.
If I'm gonna take a shot here, I kind of want to go upside, and I think Hendon Hooker makes a lot of sense there. I think Jarren Hall makes a little bit of sense there. If I was gonna play it safe, like you know me, I'm on record. Jake Haener in round 4 or 5, like you're gonna get a solid NFL backup, right? You're gonna get a Brock Purdy, right? You're gonna get someone who was gonna sit through, execute your offense. Not gonna be anything special, but he'll keep the team on track, right? So if I'm going to play it safe, give me somebody a little bit later. If I'm looking for an NFL backup, if I'm not looking for an NFL backup, I'm looking for a starter. I don't, I want somebody who's, who I can't really find elsewhere, right? And again, let me take a shot on Hendon Hooker. I think the trick there is that, are you going to be patient enough to really know what you've got, right? Are they going to be able, like, what is your plan to develop somebody like that? So I don't know. For me, I would shoot for the upside, but I think it has to be with the plan. We saw, we said, yeah, Tennessee, good job for choosing Malik Willis, right? 3rd round, that's great. Go for that upside, right? They didn't have a plan with him, right? And you're just, at that point, what are you doing?
Yeah, you're right. And listen, we were saying the same thing about Chicago, right? Like, until they finally kind of caved and made an offense to suit Justin Fields' skill set, right? So we'll see. And I agree with you. Hooker's my number 5. I'd be more intrigued with him than a guy like Tanner McKee. But we'll see. At the running back position, I do really think Blake Corum going back to school. I really think I thought number 5 was up for grabs. But I now think number 4 and number 5 are up for grabs. I think the NFL is not going to see a clear cut number 4, number 5. I think they will see a clear cut 1, 2, 3. I think that'll be Bijan at number 1, Jahmyr Gibbs at number 2, and A-Chain. I'd be very surprised if those aren't the first 3 guys. I'd expect all of them to be gone by pick 45, pick 50. I think Bijan could go will go round 1. I think Gibbs will be on the border of round 1, early round 2. And I think A-Chain will be gone somewhere with that speed in the top 10, 15 picks of round 2. But then I really think it's up for grabs. I mean, I know, some draft people are really high on Zach Charbonnet. He's further down the ranks for me. For me, it's more Tank Bigsby, Deuce Vaughn. But I'm not sure Deuce Vaughn is going to have the love that I feel for him from the NFL teams. I think they might look at him as his limitations make him more of like an early day 3 guy or a late round 3 guy. In that late round 3, early round 4, I'd be okay a little bit earlier, but I'm not sure they will be. I still think Tank Bigsby deserves to be the 4th running back taken with now Blake Corum going back to school. But I don't know if the NFL looks at him the same way. So for me, I think Bigsby's in the mix. I think Deuce Vaughn's in the mix. I think Zach Evans, even though, unless I miss it, I haven't heard anything official on Zach Evans. Did I miss that, or has he not made a formal announcement yet? Because that's
I haven't pulled anything across my feed yet, so I'm not too sure. But
I haven't seen anything about him. I mean, staying in Ole Miss would seem weird with how much they have kind of led into Quentin Jenkins. So I think he's either got to go pro or he's got to jump back in the portal and find a place, to increase. But do NFL teams just believe in the talent? Obviously, he was on most people's number 2 or number 3 before the season started. You got Kenny McIntosh, a type of player at Georgia. But I think it's really, really up for grabs. I don't think Chris Rodriguez or Kendre Miller are going to get pushed up the board. I think it sounds like the NFL is higher on Charbonnet over those guys. So I don't know. I'm kind of at
this might be where the NFL surprises us, right? I think we've listed a lot of names, and it could be any one of those.
Sean Tucker too could be in the mix if you test really well.
I think you nailed Sean Tucker. I think he's kind of that round 3 guy. I personally think Charbonnet is kind of there too, but I had some, our friend Angelo FF, came out of the woodwork, into draft season. We were talking running backs, and he really likes Charbonnet. And man, I certainly value Angelo's opinion there too. So it will be a fascinating one there. But is it somebody that surprises us, right? Is it a Roshan Johnson that somebody's taking from athleticism? That's where I think the NFL is going to surprise us. I don't know how to call this tier of running backs and where they come off the board. Some of them I think feel safer. Like I said, Sean Tucker round 3 feels right about there. Deuce Vaughn, pick 75 to 110, something early day 4, late day 3. I think he's probably, like you have him ranked high. I think that's fair because I think the weapon and what he can bring as a team. But if that's not what you're focused on, that's not what you feel you need. And that's a pretty niche role for a lot of teams. Not, teams don't necessarily deploy many of those types of players. Some do, some really innovative offenses do, but you're not going to see, Deuce Vaughn in Tennessee, Atlanta, right? Where does Zach Evans go? His tape is there. His production is not. It's, he's just an enigma as far as, not having the tangible proof of the type of problem solver he is, to look at and say, this is the guy I want to put my chips behind. So if I were kind of going my 3, 4, 5, I personally think I haven't been able to move off of Zach Evans. I think he's going to slide in there for me. I am a Deuce Vaughn fan, so I love that you have him kind of up there. I think Bigsby is worth that consideration. I do have some concerns. I don't think he's well-rounded, but I do think he has enough athleticism, to be a splashy player. I don't know if he's technically sound enough to be a consistent player. And so how does that roll? Like, what is his role in for a team? I don't think they'll pick him as an every down workhorse. I think they'll want somebody to supplement him for him to kind of learn behind. So, my 4 or 5, I'll stick with Evans and Vaughn. but I do think it's almost impossible to sort, especially because some of these there's so many they're different types of players, right? There's so many different types of players here. It's really where are they going to fit?
Yeah, and I do think the 4 and 5th running backs are really the one spot where I do feel like right now it's completely up for grabs. Like I think the top 4 quarterbacks are pretty much locked in terms of who they are. The 5th one is up for grabs. At running back, I think the top 3 pretty much locked in. I think 4, 5 really up for grabs. We already talked to wide receiver, so we don't have to really get into. I think the top 5, I feel pretty confident that there might not be movement without an injury or something in some order. Quentin Johnston, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Jordan Addison, Kayshon Boutee, Jalen Hyatt. I think those are going to be the first 5 guys. So I think the question right now, until we start hearing otherwise, is who's the guy that maybe can join that party of 5? Who can be number 6 or maybe push one of these guys down to be number 6? I have 3 contenders. You tell me which one from this list. I have 4 contenders. You tell me which one from this list potentially either could join the party and be drafted similar to the top 5 guys or like the 5th guy, whoever it ends up being, or could any of these guys push one of these guys down? If so, who would it be? The guys on my list: Josh Downs out of UNC, Rashee Rice out of SMU, Zay Flowers out of Boston College, Cedric Tillman out of Tennessee. I think that would make up the next tier of guys. Is there one on that list that you can say, I could see a scenario where this guy pushes somebody out of the top 5 and joins it, or is taken right near them, and basically it's a top group of 6 in the top 50 picks, let's say?
I don't think we're there. I'm with you. I think it's a very solid top 5. Jalen Hyatt is a very interesting, where's the gap between, Jalen Hyatt and number 4, if that's Boutee maybe, is Hyatt above Boutee? I think Addison, Quentin Johnston, and Jackson Smith-Njigba are really solidified in my mind as, solid round 1 players. And, I mentioned, Kayshon Boutee being kind of a round 2 thought for me. I think Hyatt could go round 1 because of the speed, but, from players' perspective, you're paying a premium for speed. So, between Boutee and Hyatt, like I'm not convinced Hyatt's a better player per se. I just don't think I see Josh Downs, who's electric, really, just being, I think he's an electric player. I just don't think with his size frame and sort of role for an offense, I don't see it really pushing one of those other players down. We had a great conversation with Eric with Rashee Rice, Zay Flowers, and Marvin Mims. And, I think all 3 of those, it was really hard to pick between. So maybe, I was on the Rashee Rice side, but all of those are phenomenal players. And again, I think probably round 2. So maybe my wild card would be Cedric Tillman there. I mean, he's a phenomenal receiver in his own right. Jalen Hyatt's stealing the show, but that's because he's got splashy plays. Cedric Tillman is a very fundamental receiver. And so I think if we're going to put a wild card, I think I would put it on Tillman.
Yeah, I think Tillman, listen, if he tests better, I think Tillman stock is going to be, I think he's locked into day 2, but if he tests really well and surprises us and he tests, I don't know, 4.48 or something like that, I think most people think he's going to be in the 4.5, 4.55 range. But if he tests a lot faster than that, with his ball skills, with his vertical capabilities, he tests under a 4.5 at his size, frame, and his ball skills, I think you're going to see him really, really start to rise. So I think that's a really interesting one. I think Josh Downs is interesting because, listen, maybe he can crack the party of 5 we talked about, but it depends on when the party of 5 really starts to go off the board, right? Because if Wandell can go and pick 45 last year, Josh Downs can go in the top 50 then, right? Now, I get it. That was a guy that Giants targeted as a guy that they wanted to build the offense. I mean, I was having a conversation on Twitter before. It's crazy to say, but the Giants pass offense right now, not that he's the best player, but the Giants pass offense revolves around Richie James right now, because that's just the way they've created their scheme and their structure. And that was going to be all Wandell. And we saw him breaking out until that injury. So the Giants specifically targeted Wandell because I think they looked at him as the guy that could do what they wanted to and schematically how they wanted to run things, with the slot being an integral factor. Another team has to look at Josh Downs the same way as Brian Dable and Joe Shane looked at Wandell. But if they do, I think he is the one other X factor. Him and Cedric Tillman, I think, would be the two guys that if those two guys, if anyone's going to surprise and move up, I think it would be one of those two guys for sure. But it'll be
Yeah, and
interesting.
with Downs, I mean, I think he's not quite as, you know, I don't think he'd fit a Wandale role because I think just Wandale's such a unique mover, and you know, I think Downs would be that guy you just pepper targets underneath. Almost, I was going to say Keenan Allen, but it's almost more like Austin Eckler. Just how many targets are you gonna? Is he going to be your possession receiver within but within space, within 5 yards, 10 yards, right? I think there are a few offenses that do really utilize that role well. I just don't know if that's going to be invested in. Yes, Wandale was pick 44. We know that that's an anomaly. Not to say it was a bad pick, but that was above his high end
Yes.
projection. And if we're looking at 100 drafts, where's he normally going to get picked? We're probably looking at maybe towards the middle to end of round 2, right? And so again, I think that's kind of where Josh Downs is gonna fit. Be that maybe top of round 3 kind of wide receiver. So he's fascinating. It's not that I don't think he's a good player. I just think if we're talking about someone who's going to really crack, the top end of it, I think we have to look at some of the other things that the NFL really values.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting, right? Because I feel like last year this time we didn't have Dotson high, right? As high. We liked them a lot, but it didn't sound like the NFL
But give
liked
us
them.
give us credit. I think we did. I think I
No, we
remember. I
liked them.
remember sitting here and saying he was, he was in. I remember sitting here saying he was in tier 1 for us, right?
Yes,
Like,
for
and
us, I just wasn't sure the NFL was going to view him that way. And
but
then when he went as high as he did, I think that spoke volumes. That
Dotson was a different player, though. I mean, he had a better uh, just magnet to the ball, catch
yes,
radius, hands. I think when I say Josh Downs being a possession receiver, I think again, more in the Tyler Lockett, Keenan Allen kind of get him in space and kind of just quickly dart out of bounds, kind of pepper him with 10 targets, but you're getting 10 targets with 6 catches and 65 yards kind of thing.
yeah.
Whereas like with Dotson, I mean, we've seen him be a red zone threat. We've seen him be able to catch the ball well covered. We've seen him be able to, it's just, again, just a different player there. And I think that's what makes it hard. We talked about it with running backs, but just right here with wide receivers too. These are different players. They're playing different positions. And so it might not even come to, who's the sort of the better tester or better prospect, but who's picking at that, who's looking to pick a wide receiver, at the 6th one, and what do they need on their team? It might just come down to that.
Yeah, it might very well. And then, obviously testing sometimes for wide receivers can move the needle a little bit. Surprise testing, whether it's, faster than we thought, slower than we thought, other stuff as well. Let's round this out with the tight ends, because I do feel real confident that they're not, while there might be some shuffling in it, I feel really confident how we know the top 2 are going to go. And I feel really confident in the names of 3, 4, and 5. I think the tight end, there's been a lot of clarity. I think number 6 could be up for grabs. If there's a surprise who jumps in, I think it would be who I'm going to bring up is number 6. But I think Michael Mayer and Darnell Washington are locked in at 1 and 2. It sounds like both have a legitimate shot to go in round 1. If not round 1 for Washington, early round 2 for him. Teams to seem, from people in the know, from Dane Brugler to other people, it sounds like the NFL is obsessed with Darnell Washington. They think that if it wasn't for Brock Bowers being such an elite level prospect, Darnell Washington could be a much bigger factor in the passing game. He's an elite blocker, and that's so rare for a player coming out as a tight end to be that in terms of the NFL. So I think Michael Mayer, Darnell Washington locked in at 1 and 2. And then I think the other 3, 4, 5 names that you hear over and over in some particular order is Tucker Kraft out of South Dakota State. Talked a lot about him this year, especially before the season started. Reminds me a lot of of Dallas Goedert, Dalton Kincaid out of Utah. And then while he only played 2 games due to injury, this was a guy, Luke Musgrave out of Oregon State, was high on Dane Brugler's list before the year started, was on Bruce Feldman's freak list. There wasn't a lot of tape that we had access to, but it sure sounded like the NFL loved this kid before the season even started. Dane was pumping him up. Bruce Feldman was pumping him up. He was on a lot of boards that you saw in terms of tight end prospects to watch. It sounds like, even though he only played 2 games this year due to injury, it sounds like the NFL is still really, really into Luke Musgrave, the athleticism, the untapped upside. I think Sam Laporta would be the next guy that maybe could push Kincaid or Musgrave down. But I think Laporta and some athletic concerns maybe have pushed him down a little bit. I think he's more of kind of like where we saw Cade Otton and Bellinger go last year. I think that's probably where Laporta ends up being in the mix, like an early day 3 guy. Well, I think the first 5 guys, I think Mayer and Washington, we're talking round 1 or early round 2. And then I think maybe the other guys that we could see day 2 or that Tucker Kraft, Kincaid. And it sounds like Luke Musgrave is the guy that really intrigues NFL circles. So Jeff, any thoughts on the tight end position there? And amazingly, Arik Gilbert, not on this list. Didn't see that one coming before the year started, that he would literally just vanish. I have no idea. I don't know what he's doing. I feel like we don't even get reports on him. Maybe I'm not digging enough. But like Arik Gilbert, who we thought legitimately had a chance to be tight end 1 in this class, if he kept his head on straight and played, just missing from this list. And I didn't see that one coming before the season started. Or maybe I should have seen it coming because of all the things that have surrounded him. But if he played this year, and we thought he was, even a little bit, the NFL would have been intrigued with him for sure.
I'll probably save the very last pick in all of my rookie drafts for Arik Gilbert. Just for that one, that little chance that he, pops. Sam Laporta, I think is sort of the safe option there, right? I think there's Musgrave. It sounds like, again, just, NFL draft buzz, really likes him. I think Laporta there is a guy I've just kind of kept my eye on all year. Again, I think he's sort of a low ceiling, high floor kind of player. And I think it'd be a very safe option. And if for any reason one of those guys falls, right? If we a Kincaid or a Musgrave falls, I think Laporta will be there to just kind of, slide into that spot.
Yeah, so it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be interesting to kind of circle back to this. Maybe like we always do a couple shows like the week of the draft, final projections, just kind of like revisit like, oh, these were the guys we mentioned, on January 10th. Are they still the guys? Like when I set my final board for the draft projections notebook, are these the guys that we're talking about still at the top? I think quarterback, yeah. I think running back, the top, yeah. It'd be interesting to kind of see where heads out of that. Is there any changes in the names of the 5 receivers and the 5 tight ends? And if there is it Laporta, who we just talked about, tight end? Is it Tillman or Downs, at the wide receiver position? How much movement and change is there? I mean, because like we go over this whole NFL season, the whole college season, but then draft season almost is just as long, right? We got January, we got February, we got March, we got April, we got 4 months. We got the All-Star games for the seniors. We got the combine, we got the, the pro days. So a lot of stuff that could add more data to the mix to see if these things change at all. And obviously here at Saturday, Sunday, we will be covering it wire to wire as we always do. If you are enjoying what Jeff and I are putting out here, please get over to the website, ssfootball.com. Fastest and quickest way to get there. Check out the premium content tab. And for $9.99, you get access to all our premium notebooks. I know I spent those 2 weeks off when we didn't record a podcast. I updated my draft eligible rankings. I will, when final declarations are out, I will split it up and create a new tab with only the guys who are in the draft. I updated Devy rankings. I updated my 2022 NFL rookie rankings now that the season has concluded, going into the offseason. And I updated all of my positional overall dynasty rankings as well. That was technically prior to the last week of the NFL season. But a lot of updates. All that can be found in the rankings notebook. That'll have our tiers up in it soon. So a lot of stuff in there. the scouting notebook. I will be updating things. I will be adding players. I'll be separating it so it's easy to see who the guys who are in this year's draft is. And then obviously the draft projections notebook comes out in April. Tabs for every position, offense and defense. Over 400 guys in that with some notes on all of them and how we expect it to go from everything we are here. And you get it all for $9.99. Best way to support the show and help us continue to do what we're doing. Download, subscribe to the YouTube page, all that stuff to help us out if you can't purchase the premium notebooks. Jeff, any final parting shots here to put a bow on the college football season before we 100% turn it towards recapping the NFL rookie season and then just getting ready for the 2023 NFL draft?
Yeah, just great news from Damar Hamlin. That was one of those ones where it would have made hard to follow the rest of the season of football if we didn't know he was going to be okay. But we're just getting started here. This is going to be a fun 4 months, and then we've got a lot more narrative to color in after that. So, this is the busy season.
Yes, absolutely. And Jeff and I and guests will be here to cover it wire to wire for you. So on behalf of Jeff, on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nicano, and myself, thank you for joining us. And we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.